He stood up. The room went quiet. Everyone was waiting for the announcement, the engagement, the deal that would save the company, the plan his father had spent months engineering. But instead, he turned his head, scanned the room slowly, and pointed, not at the woman standing beside his father, but at the girl carrying the champagne tray. Her. She's my fiancée. The ballroom froze, his father furious, the heiress speechless, the investors exchanging glances, and her, the woman who had worked for him for a year, gripped the tray with both hands so she wouldn't drop it. But the real question was, would she be willing to become the fake fiancée of the man who never once bothered to learn her name? To understand who Nora Walsh was before that night, we have to go back to a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store in Queens, New York, to the smell of motor oil coming through the vents, her mother's sewing machine running past midnight, and a father who came home from the garage with grease under his fingernails, but something steady and unhurried in his eyes that looked a lot like dignity. Nora grew up in that apartment. What she was, she learned there, that things worth having are built with work, that complaining without acting is just noise, that you can have very little and still have everything if you know what you're looking for. What Nora was looking for was the stage. She started dancing at 7 in a rec center program that cost $12 a month because the director, a woman named Ruth, who had danced in touring companies in her 20s, believed that dance shouldn't belong only to those who could afford private studios. Nora showed up the first day in the wrong shoes, and with a focus in her eyes that Ruth would mention years later as the first sign that this girl was different. She kept going at 14, at 17, at 22. She kept going when the scholarship she earned for business school left her almost no free time. She kept going when her father hurt his back badly enough to miss 6 months of work, and she had to find a second income to help cover rent. It was during those months that Nora understood something no textbook had taught her. Shame is a luxury you cannot afford when the people you love need help. She showed up to the Hargrove building on a Tuesday morning with her resume printed and a blazer she'd borrowed from her roommate. The building manager told her the tenant in the 41st floor penthouse was looking for a household assistant. "Any references?" he asked. "I'm punctual, organized, and I don't break things," Nora answered. He hired her that afternoon. Her employer was Ethan Hargrove. It was not love at first sight. It was the complete opposite. The first week, Ethan came home at 3 in the morning twice, left a designer jacket soaked from rain on the hallway floor, and called Nora Nicole on Thursday. Nora corrected him with a voice so even he couldn't tell if she was annoyed or simply unbothered. A year of learning someone else's rhythms without them learning yours. Until that night. That afternoon, something in the penthouse felt different. Ethan had been locked in his home office for 2 days, the kind of exhaustion in his face that had nothing to do with late nights out. When Nora passed the half-open door with a basket of dry cleaning, she saw him pacing with his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what the board says. I need that contract signed before Friday." Nora kept walking. Not her business. At 6 o'clock, Ethan came out of the office looking like someone calculating how many problems he could ignore at once. He crossed the living room without looking at her, opened the fridge, grabbed a water bottle, closed it, passed by Nora as if the space between them had no temperature, no weight, no person in it. "Did anyone call?" he asked, eyes on his phone. "Your scheduler, twice. I left the messages on your desk in the blue folder, same as always." Ethan nodded without responding and kept walking. Then the doorbell rang. A friend of his, expensive suit, more expensive watch, the kind of person who measures everyone by what they're wearing, walked in with the ease of someone who's been here before. "Who's she?" the friend asked, glancing at Nora the same way he might glance at a new piece of furniture. "The help," Ethan answered without looking up from his phone. Nora kept wiping down the kitchen counter. She didn't look up. She didn't change her pace, but something inside her registered those words with the cold precision of someone who has spent a long time learning to store what hurts somewhere it won't interfere. The help, 1 year, 365 days of arriving on time, organizing what he lost, anticipating what he needed before he knew he needed it. And she was the help. Ethan and his friend disappeared into the office. Nora finished wiping the counter, breathed, and told herself what she always told herself in these moments, that people who don't know your name don't get to define your value, that her Broadway dance intensive was on Wednesday, that the open audition she'd been training for was in 3 weeks, and if she stayed focused, she'd be ready. She was always ready. Then from the hallway, Ethan's voice, "Hey, what's your name?" The cloth stopped moving in her hands. "Nora," she said. "My name is Nora. I've worked here for a year." Ethan looked at her with the expression of someone who has just realized something that should have mattered a long time ago and still doesn't quite matter enough. "Right," he said. "Nora," and kept walking. Nora set the cloth down on the counter. This time she didn't tell herself anything. This time she just breathed. "Tonight there's an event at my parents' house. I need you to serve." Nora turned off the faucet. "That's not in my usual duties. I'll pay you double." She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Her car insurance was due, and she'd missed 3 weeks of payments toward her dance studio fees. Fine. What nobody told her was what that night was actually for. The Hargrove estate was in Greenwich, Connecticut, 40 minutes from Manhattan and a different world entirely. Stone walls, manicured hedges, the kind of house that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Nora arrived with the catering staff and spent the first 2 hours doing exactly what she'd been asked, circling with champagne trays, invisible and efficient. She studied Richard Hargrove from a distance. Early 60s, straight posture, the look of a man accustomed to things going the way he planned. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who had been building relationships for decades, shook the right hands, laughed at the right moments. He was in many ways everything Ethan was not. Ethan arrived 40 minutes late. Of course, but Nora noticed. Behind the easy smile, he was tense. His eyes moved too fast across the room, lingering on the woman standing beside Richard, Cassandra Whitfield, early 30s, dark hair pulled into a low chignon, navy dress, the posture of someone who has known exactly what she's worth since she was 12 years old, the heiress. Richard tapped his glass. "Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter for Hargrove Industries," he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man about to announce something he has thoroughly engineered. "An alliance that is not merely professional, but personal. My son Ethan will be announcing his engagement to Cassandra Whitfield before the end of the year." Applause. Cassandra smiled with practiced grace. Ethan did not applaud. 3 seconds of silence. "Dad," Ethan said, and his voice cut through the clapping with the soft danger of something sharp. "I appreciate the gesture, I really do, but there's a small problem. I can't marry Cassandra." Richard turned slowly. "Because I'm already engaged." That was the moment. Ethan turned his head and looked directly at her. "To Nora, my fiancée." The next 60 seconds were the longest of Nora Walsh's life. She felt every set of eyes in that room find her at once. The tray got heavier. Cassandra held her smile, but something behind her eyes hardened like concrete setting, and Richard Hargrove looked at Nora with the expression of a man who has just bitten into what he thought was a truffle and discovered it's a button. "I'm sorry. Who?" "Nora," Ethan repeated, stepping toward her, one hand settling at the small of her back with completely unearned ease. "We've kept it quiet. You know how private I am about what actually matters to me. She's your housekeeper. She's extraordinary." "Ethan, do you have a problem with that, Dad?" Ethan's voice was light but edged. "Because if you do, this would be a very poor moment to show it. With everyone watching." Richard scanned the room. 50 pairs of eyes looked back at him. He made a calculation. Then, with a smile that stopped well short of his eyes, he raised his glass. "Then let's congratulate them both." It was only when the last guest had gone through the front door that Nora allowed herself to set the tray down. She placed it on the dining room table harder than she intended. 3 crystal glasses rang against each other. Ethan, who was straightening his tie with an expression of moderate satisfaction, glanced sideways at her. "You're angry." "Angry," Nora repeated, and the word came out with a calm that was really the last step before something far less calm. "Angry. Very angry, maybe." "Ethan." She planted herself in front of him. "What did you just do? Technically, saved the evening. You pointed at me in front of 50 people and told them I'm your fiancé. 43, I counted. Nora pressed her jaw together. "You're out of your mind, completely out of your mind." "I'm not out of my mind," he said, and for the first time that night, the lightness dropped out of his voice. "I'm desperate. There's a difference." She looked at him. Something in his face wasn't the usual performance. It was smaller than that, more real, more uncomfortable. "The company is 90 days away from needing capital we don't have," he said, quieter now. "My father's solution is this merger through marriage. But I've spent 6 months negotiating a contract with an industrial consortium that solves the same problem without me marrying anyone. The problem is that contract closes in 3 weeks, and if my father steps in before then—" "You lose it," she finished, If I walk into that closing meeting as the CEO who handled this himself, the board backs me, and my father has no argument. He met her eyes directly. 3 weeks, Nora, just long enough for my father to believe I have my life together, that I'm not the disaster he thinks I am. Nora exhaled slowly. And what am I in this? Your prop? You're the most capable and convincing person I know. I'm your housekeeper. That's what the contract says. But you and I both know you're considerably more than that. She crossed her arms. That's not a compliment. That's manipulation with a better presentation. Ethan had the decency to look at least slightly embarrassed. 3 weeks. A few family dinners. Some events. Then we announce things didn't work out. You leave with compensation that lets you focus on your auditions as long as you need. And we both move on. Nora looked at him for a long moment. I have 6 cats, she said finally. Ethan blinked. Excuse me? You said in front of everyone that the only thing I had to worry about was my 6 cats. Her voice was flat, perfectly controlled. I don't have 6 cats, Ethan. I have 2. And they're both named after Broadway dancers, because that's what I am. Someone with a dream she's working toward. I am not a resource you point at when you need one. Ethan didn't respond immediately. You're right, he said, and it sounded sincere enough that Nora didn't quite know what to do with it. That was a stupid thing to say. Stupid things don't get taken back. They get paid for. A pause. How much? Nora thought about her dance studio, the missed payment, the audition shoes she needed to replace. Double my current rate for all 3 weeks, and if this runs 1 day longer than agreed, the rate triples. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. Deal. And, she added, starting tomorrow you explain everything about your company, your investors, and that contract. If I'm going to play your fiancée in front of people who ask intelligent questions, I need intelligent answers. Ethan looked at her with something that, for the first time, resembled actual respect. Agreed. And Ethan. She picked up her bag. The next time you decide to point at me in front of 43 people without warning me first, 43, I will drop the tray directly on you. She left, and Ethan Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Industries, a man used to getting his way, stood alone in the dining room, looking at the closed door with an expression he couldn't quite classify. What followed was a quiet negotiation of territory. Nora arrived at the penthouse at 9 the next morning with a legal pad and a list of questions that Ethan looked at like it might be a weapon. They sat at the kitchen island, she with her black coffee, he with his green juice, which was the only healthy thing he consumed before noon, and she started. What is the core financial problem right now? Why is the consortium deal better than the Whitfield merger? Where are the weakest points in the contract? What specifically concerns the investor group? At first, Ethan answered with the tone of someone explaining the obvious to someone who has no business understanding it. But Nora asked precise follow-up questions. She identified contradictions. She pointed out gaps in the argument. By the second hour, Ethan had stopped explaining and was thinking out loud. By the third, Nora had a clear map of the actual problem on the table and 2 ideas that Ethan wrote in his own notebook without being asked. Where did you learn this? I'm finishing a business degree, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I didn't know that. You don't ask anything about the people who work for you. That landed quietly between them. No argument, no drama. But Ethan never used that patient, explaining voice with her again. The first real test came 4 days later. Richard invited them to dinner on Saturday, family only, plus Ethan's younger sister Lily, 25 years old, and according to Ethan, equipped with a detector for dishonesty that had never once failed. They built their story the way you build a case file. Dates, details, internal logic. They settled on a conversation 8 months earlier, when Nora had found a folder of important documents Ethan had misplaced and organized them without being asked. That it had grown from there, gradually. It was, curiously, a story with real elements in it. The Saturday dinner was manageable in form, but it had one crack Nora hadn't anticipated. Margaret Hargrove, Ethan's mother, was a woman with warm eyes and hands that were always doing something, the kind of person who expressed care through feeding people. She asked Nora exactly the questions Ethan had predicted, and Nora answered them calmly, without rushing, without decoration. Richard, however, was different from the night of the party, cooler, more watchful. He wasn't rude. He would never be rude in front of his wife, but he chose the moment after dessert to ask the question he'd been holding all evening. Where are you from originally, Nora? Queens. Born and raised. A small pause. Working class neighborhood? My dad runs a garage, Nora answered without changing her tone. He's back on his feet now after some health issues last year. Richard nodded and returned to his dessert. But the silence he left behind wasn't neutral. It was the silence of someone filing information, drawing conclusions they weren't yet ready to say aloud. Lily arrived late with paint on her wrist and Ethan's exact eye color. For the first 20 minutes, she said almost nothing. She just watched. It was over coffee that she asked Nora, "Who's your favorite dancer?" "Judith Jameson," Nora said without hesitation. "For what she built, not just what she performed." Lily nodded slowly, then looked at her brother with an expression Nora couldn't fully read. On the drive back to the city, Ethan was quiet for several minutes. "My mother would legally adopt you if she could. Your father is evaluating me." "My father evaluates everyone. Not the same way." Nora looked out the window. "The questions about the neighborhood, about my dad. He wanted to know where I come from, whether I'm suitable." Ethan gripped the steering wheel. "He has a right to ask," Nora said before he could respond. "What matters is what he does with the answers." Ethan said nothing, but something in him shifted a millimeter. The following week brought the country house weekend, and with it, the second complication on the list. Margaret called to invite them with the genuine enthusiasm she had for everything. The house had 4 bedrooms. She had already made up the guest room. 1 guest room. Singular. Ethan informed Nora of this with the expression of someone handing over a grenade with the pin already pulled. "No," said Nora. "If we ask for separate rooms, it raises questions. Then make up an excuse not to go. If we don't go, my father starts doubting, and if he doubts before the contract closes..." "Ethan." "Nora, I'm sleeping on the couch. The couch in that room is a reading chair. It's maybe 4.5 feet long." Nora looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone asking the universe for patience. "If you cross the pillow wall, I will call your father right now and tell him everything. I won't cross it, not even in your sleep. I sleep still." That's not a sufficient guarantee, but it was. Until Saturday morning at 7:15, when Richard Hargrove opened the bedroom door without knocking. It was his house. He had never needed to knock. What he found was Ethan asleep on the right side of the bed, and Nora sitting in the reading chair by the window, completely dressed, a book open in her lap and a mug of coffee in her hand, looking out at the garden. The 3 of them stared at each other for a second that had the density of an hour. "Good morning," Nora said, her voice perfectly level. Richard looked at the chair, then at the bed, then at his son, who had just opened his eyes and had no idea what was happening. "Good morning," Richard said finally. "Breakfast is ready." He closed the door. Ethan sat up and looked at Nora. "How long have you been awake?" "Since 6. "Why are you already dressed?" "Because I'm an early riser, and because if your father came in, I'd rather he found us like this." "You anticipated that?" "I calculated it was probable." Ethan looked at the empty chair, then back at her, thinking about how a year ago this woman was nothing to him, beyond someone who knew where he kept his keys, and how completely wrong that had been. The country house was beautiful in a simple way that Nora found unexpectedly moving. Wide porch, old oak trees, a kitchen that smelled like something slow-cooked, and Margaret pulled her into Sunday meal preparation with a naturalness that left Nora slightly off balance, because no one had treated her that way in a long time, like someone who simply belonged in the space. That night, already in the room with the pillow wall properly constructed, Nora was reading when Ethan said into the dark, "Why do you dance?" She lowered her book. "Why do you ask?" "Genuine question. You've spent 20 years on something with no financial guarantee. That demands everything from your body. Doesn't always reward you. Why do you keep going?" Nora thought about the real answer before giving it. She thought about Ruth's rec center, the smell of rosin and sprung floors, her mother's sewing machine humming past midnight, the particular feeling that movement was the only thing that never asked her to explain herself. "Because when I'm on stage, everything else stops existing." She paused. "Not the unpaid bills, not the exhaustion, not whatever went wrong that week. There's only the music and the movement. It's the only time I'm completely myself." Silence. "I don't have anything like that," Ethan said. "I know." Another silence. Longer. "What does it feel like?" "Like being home, but actually home, not just the place where you live." No more words that night, but Nora took longer than usual to fall asleep, and it wasn't from discomfort. The next morning, Richard found her in the garden. He walked her toward the rose beds that Margaret tended and waited until they were far enough from the house. "You're smart and you work hard," he said, no preamble. "What I don't see is what you have to do with my son. You and Ethan are different." "Yes," Nora said. Richard looked at her, surprised by the brevity. "That doesn't concern you." The difference isn't the problem. The problem would be if the values were different. And Ethan's values? Nora thought about the Ethan of a year ago and the one of the last several weeks. They're there. No one has required him to use them yet. Richard didn't answer, but the wall he'd been was softened slightly, as if a seam had given. The contract closed on a Thursday at 11 in the morning, and then Richard called Ethan into his study. There was a folder on the desk. "I had someone look into Nora," Richard said without opening with anything else. "Her employment history, her financial situation, her family." Ethan went still. "Nothing illegal," his father said. "Just information. A young woman with limited means, a father who needed financial help last year, and an employer with considerable resources. You see where I'm going?" Ethan saw, and felt something he rarely felt, genuine anger that had nothing performative in it. "You're saying she's with me for the money. I'm saying it's a possibility you shouldn't ignore." "I can, and I do," Ethan said, his voice colder than usual, because cold was what happened when the anger was real. "Because you've known her 3 weeks and I've known her a year. Because she has said no to me more times in 1 month than anyone in my entire life. Because when she could have stayed quiet in a business meeting and smiled nicely, she chose to tell the truth when it didn't benefit her." Richard listened without interrupting. "The contract you closed today," he said finally. "Did you do that on your own? With her help?" A long silence. Richard pushed the folder to the edge of the desk. "Bring her to dinner Sunday," he said. "Please." It was the first time in a long time that Ethan had heard that please from his father, and he understood it wasn't a disguised order. It was a man learning to release control of a story that wasn't his. The second week brought the most important meeting. Ethan had to present to 3 partners from the industrial consortium. Casual lunch, but nothing casual about what was at stake. "Come," Ethan said. "If I come as myself, not as decoration." Agreed. 20 minutes in, the conversation drifted toward a technical point about supply chain structure, and Ethan began losing ground. One of the partners, the senior one, grey-haired, the kind of man whose attention you feel when you have it and miss when you don't, had turned slightly toward the window. Nora spoke. "If I can add something, the core issue here is capacity redundancy in the Northeast Corridor. The current Hargrove model assumes stable volume, but your consortium's projections factor in seasonal peaks. The existing infrastructure wouldn't absorb. The proposal Ethan brought actually addresses that directly if you cross-reference the capacity annex on page 17. All 3 partners looked at her. The senior partner turned back from the window. "What's your background?" he asked. "Business, finishing my degree. But this isn't a logistics problem. It's a data reading problem. And the data is right there." The meeting recalibrated. Ethan found the thread again. The conversation found its direction. At the end of the lunch, the senior partner shook Nora's hand before Ethan's. "Sharp," he said, and held his business card toward her a half-second longer than necessary. "If you're ever looking for new opportunities, reach out." Nora accepted the card with a nod. Ethan smiled in a way that didn't make it to his eyes. In the cab back to Manhattan, he was quiet for longer than usual. Nora glanced sideways at him, arms crossed, staring at the street, with that specific expression she'd learned to read as irritation that doesn't want to name itself. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Fine. You sure?" "Yes. Why?" "No reason," Nora said, and looked back out her window so she wouldn't smile. Ethan didn't answer, but a moment later, without it seeming intentional, he shifted in his seat so he was angled between her and the window, as if the space between them needed to close by 1 inch. Nora didn't say anything, but she noted that inch. He spoke eventually. "You knew exactly where the problem was. I read it 5 times this week. No one on my team caught that. Maybe your team is afraid to point out what you're not seeing." Ethan turned to look at her. "Did I intimidate you? You annoyed me. There's a difference." He let out something close to a real laugh, genuine, unguarded, and Nora realized it was the first time in a year she had heard him laugh like that. Cassandra Whitfield was not the kind of woman who accepted losing without understanding why. 3 days after the consortium lunch, Nora received a connection request on her professional profile from an account she didn't recognize. Generic name, company logo as the photo. But when she checked mutual connections, there was one, Ethan Hargrove. She ignored it. The next day, while filing documents in the penthouse, the front desk called up. A woman claiming to be from an event planning firm wanted to confirm tenant information for a mailing. Nora gave the standard answer and hung up. That evening, Ethan came home with that expression she had learned meant contained displeasure. "Cassandra has been asking about you," he said. "How?" "She asked my assistant whether you were building staff. My assistant said nothing. But Cassandra doesn't ask questions out of curiosity. What does she want to prove? That this isn't real. If she proves it before the contract closes, my father revives the merger plan and the board loses confidence in me." Nora set the folder down. "How long until the contract?" 12 days. "Then 12 days, she said. It wasn't a declaration of loyalty. It was arithmetic. But Ethan looked at her in a way that made the two difficult to distinguish. What neither of them knew was that Cassandra had already made her next move. 4 days later, she appeared at the Hargrove family home without an invitation. Margaret, who was constitutionally incapable of closing a door in anyone's face, let her in. Richard received her with the neutrality of a man who also makes calculations. Ethan, seeing her in the hallway, had the expression of someone watching a fire he can no longer contain. Nora was coming from the kitchen with a pitcher of water when Cassandra's eyes found her. "What a coincidence," Cassandra said, with a smile that had exactly the temperature of polished glass. "The fiancée, Cassandra," Nora answered with the same evenness she applied to everything. "I'm glad you're here. I've been wanting to ask you something. What exactly did you do before all this?" The silence lasted 1 second. "A lot of things," Nora said. "Work doesn't define me. What I do with it does." Cassandra smiled. "Of course, just curious." Richard watched the exchange from the other end of the room. Lily from the staircase had her arms crossed. Cassandra left 20 minutes later, but before she did, she stopped beside Nora in the hallway. "You're very good," she said quietly. "But things that aren't real don't last. They never do." Nora met her eyes without looking away. "That's why I only build real things." Cassandra's smile shifted, colder, more calculated. She opened her clutch and produced a sealed envelope, held it between 2 fingers. 3 months of your current salary," she said. "In exchange for telling the truth, that's all. 1 conversation with Richard." Nora looked at the envelope, looked at it for 1 full second. "Keep it," she said. "That's a significant amount of money for someone in your position." "Keep it," Nora repeated, and there was no anger in her voice, only that steadiness of hers, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're worth and not needing anyone to confirm it. Cassandra tucked the envelope away without losing her composure. "Shame," she said. "This could have been simpler for everyone," and she left. Nora stood alone in the hallway for a moment. She looked at the closed door. Then she took out her phone and typed a 3-word message to Ethan. "We need to talk." It was Lily who said it out loud. She showed up at the penthouse on a Wednesday with no warning, a bag of donuts, and that particular energy of hers that suggested she had already reached a conclusion and was simply verifying the details. She found Nora and Ethan in the living room, going over a presentation together, both of them leaning toward the same screen, talking quietly with the kind of ease that builds without your noticing. Lily stood in the doorway. "Oh," she said. Ethan looked up. "Lily, calling ahead exists." "It does," she said, dropping the donuts on the table and sitting down as if invited. "But sometimes the most interesting things happen when you don't." Nora started closing documents with an efficiency that had a slight quality of retreat about it. "I'll make coffee," she said. "I'd love some," Lily announced. "And I want you to stay. This is for both of you." Nora stayed. Lily looked at the two of them with the calm of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion. "When are you two going to figure it out?" she asked. "Figure what out?" Ethan said. "That this," she gestured at the space between them, "stopped being an arrangement at least a week ago." Silence. "Lily," Ethan started, "don't bother denying it to me." Her voice wasn't reproachful. It was almost gentle. "I've known you your whole life. And you—" She looked at Nora. "I've seen you 3 times and I already know how he looks at you." Nora felt something shift in her chest. She ignored it. "The arrangement ends when the contract closes," she said, her voice flat. "Arrangements end," Lily said. "What you feel doesn't operate on a schedule." She picked up a donut, examined it with satisfaction. "I'm just giving you both a heads up, so neither of you is surprised when it's time to be honest." She left with her donuts and the same energy she'd come in with, leaving behind something too small to call a revelation, but too real to dismiss. Richard called 4 days before the contract closed. He had already paid for a venue. Nora could tell from Ethan's face when he hung up, the kind of expression that isn't panic but is very close to it. "He booked a date," Ethan said. "For what?" "The wedding." Nora opened her mouth, closed it. "Without asking you?" without asking me. He says since we're engaged, the logical next step is to formalize it, that it's a gift. Ethan, I know. This has gotten out of hand. I know, Nora. She stood up and walked to the window. Below, Manhattan continued its rhythm, unaware of paid venues and pending contracts, and an arrangement that had grown more complicated than either of them had planned. When the contract closes, you have to tell your father the truth, everything, that it was an arrangement. That I was never actually your fiancé. Yes, and I'm done here. Ethan didn't answer right away. She heard his steps behind her. She kept looking at the city. What if I don't want you to be done here? He said, and his voice had nothing calculated in it anymore. She turned. Ethan was a foot away, without the usual ease, without the armor of irony. Just him, uncomfortably honest, for the first time in all the time she'd known him. Lily is right, he said. I've known it for days, and I've been trying not to say it because saying it makes everything more complicated. Nora looked at him for a moment. She couldn't measure. When I started working here, she said slowly, you didn't even know my last name. Walsh, Nora Walsh. Your dad runs a garage in Queens. You're finishing a business degree. You've been dancing for 20 years. You have 2 cats named after Broadway dancers. You fall asleep reading and leave the book face down on the pillow. You make coffee before I'm awake, even though I've never asked you to. And when you're working on something that matters to you, you bite your lower lip without noticing. Silence. When did you start noticing that? Honestly, I think longer ago than I was ready to admit. Nora let out a breath. It wasn't a grand moment. It wasn't music and perfect light. It was just her taking one step, and him staying still so he wouldn't startle her, and the space between them closing in the most natural way possible. When she finally spoke, it was from his shoulder. If this is going to be real, there are new rules. Tell me. No pointing at me in front of groups of people without warning. Fair. And you learn the full name of everyone who works for you. Starting now. Also fair. And the contract closes on its own merits. Your win, not mine. With your help. With my contribution, she corrected, which is different. He didn't argue. The contract closed on Thursday at 11 in the morning, and then Richard called Ethan into the study. There was a folder on the desk. Ethan came home that evening with that expression, not the one he used for bad news, but the one she'd learned meant something had shifted in him. He had someone investigate you, Ethan said. And I told him exactly what I think, that he's wrong, that he knows you less than he believes, and that even if he were right about everything, it still wouldn't change anything for me. Nora absorbed that in silence. How do you feel? He asked. A pause. Tired, she said honestly, of having to prove myself, of the starting point of every conversation about me being what I don't have. I know, and I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for it. You're not the one doing it. But it's my family, yes. Nora looked at the cat in her lap for a moment. But it's also the family that made you, and you're here saying this to me. That counts too. Ethan said nothing, but he extended his hand across the table between them. Not a dramatic gesture, just an open hand. Nora looked at it for a second and took it. 4 days before the theater, Cassandra called Nora one more time. This time, no envelope, no in-person confrontation, just a phone call at 10 at night, when defenses are lower. I'm not calling to cause trouble, she said, with that soft voice that was the precise opposite. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know something. Ethan Hargrove has always used what's convenient when he needs it. You were convenient. Pause. When this is over, and it will be over, you'll still be the help, just a little more used than before. The call ended. Nora sat with her phone in her hand. Her 2 cats slept. The lamp in the corner held steady. She thought about the Ethan of a year ago, and the one of the last several weeks. The hand extended across the table. The text at 10:20. Are you okay? The way he had faced his father in that study without anyone asking him to. The way he'd folded the letter carefully before setting it down. There are 2 ways to face doubt. From fear, or from what you know. She knew what she had seen. And what she had seen was not someone using her. It was someone learning. The next afternoon, when Ethan arrived to find her in the living room running through choreography in her dance shoes, he stopped in the entrance and said nothing. He let her finish. Cassandra called, Nora said, lowering the music. Did the doubt take hold? No, because I know the difference between what someone says about a person and what that person has actually shown me. Ethan exhaled. I should have warned you she'd probably do something like that. Yes, you should have. No edge to it, but it's done. Then he found the letter. It was in the document folder Nora had organized that afternoon, mixed in with old correspondence. A small envelope with an official letterhead, dated 10 months ago. Ethan opened it without thinking, read it, and went still. It was an acceptance letter. Nora Walsh had been selected to join the company as a principal dancer for the upcoming Broadway season. Response deadline, 9 months ago. No response on record. He looked up. "Then what is this?" Nora looked at the letter, didn't speak for a moment. "An opportunity I couldn't take." "Why?" "Because my father couldn't work. Because relocating cost money I didn't have. Because there were things more urgent than my dreams at that point in time." Ethan held the letter for a long moment. "Nora, it's done," she said, with a calm that wasn't resignation but something firmer than that. "Doors don't always open when you want them to. Sometimes they open later, differently." Ethan folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. He didn't say anything else that night, but something in him rearranged completely. The night of the performance arrived with all the weight of things that actually matter. The Meridian Theatre on West 45th Street had that particular stillness that older houses have, decades of music absorbed into the walls, so that when the lights went down, the silence itself felt prepared for something. Nora performed in the ensemble for the first act, but there was a moment, near the end of the second, when the ensemble opened up and each dancer held the stage alone for 8 bars. 8 bars. For someone who had waited 20 years, 8 bars was enough. From the 7th row, Ethan watched her move under the lights and understood finally what she had described to him in the dark of the country house bedroom, being home. But actually home. It was the same presence she had in business meetings, when she held his father's stare without shifting, when she said no with the same ease others say yes. It was what she had set aside for 10 months so her father could recover. It was what she had never told anyone. Lily, sitting beside him, gave him a quiet nudge. "Close your mouth," she murmured. He did. In the corridor backstage after the show, Ethan waited with the patience of someone who has learned that some things can't be rushed. When Nora came out, still in stage makeup, her dance bag over one shoulder, he was exactly where he'd said he would be. 2 flowers. Exactly 2, because she had told him once that grand gestures seemed hollow to her. "How was it?" she asked. "Perfect," he said, and he didn't mean only the performance. Nora took the flowers, looked at him. "2 things. Tell me. First, thank you for being on time. It required significant personal effort. I believe it. Second thing." "What?" She went up on the balls of her feet, 20 years of habit, and kissed him briefly, with the same quiet precision she applied to everything that mattered. When she stepped back, Ethan took a moment to open his eyes. "Was that in the new rules?" he asked. "I just added it." He smiled, not the usual one. This one was smaller and more real, and made of something that had been forming for weeks without either of them scheduling it. Margaret was dabbing her eyes and looking determinedly at the ceiling. Lily stood at the end of the corridor with her arms folded, and the expression of someone who placed a bet and won it weeks ago. And Richard Hargrove, who had also come, without being asked, held the folded program in both hands. Before the evening ended, he found Nora. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the investigation, for the questions, for measuring you with the wrong standard." "What was the wrong standard?" "The one that measures where someone comes from," he said, "instead of where they're going." Nora thought about her father cleaning his hands before coming inside, her mother at the sewing machine past midnight, the letter she had never answered. "My father taught me that dignity doesn't depend on your starting point," she said, "only on how you carry yourself." Richard looked at her for a moment. "Your father is right." At the end of the corridor, Nora's parents waited, her mother with her hands folded in her lap, her father with clean hands. He had scrubbed them twice before leaving the garage, the same as he had for her first recital at the rec center when she was 9 years old. Richard walked toward them and extended his hand. "You have a remarkable daughter," he said. Nora's father looked at him with the eyes of a man who has worked his whole life without asking anyone for recognition. "I know," he said. 3 weeks later, Nora Walsh danced as a principal for the first time. It was a small production, an off-Broadway showcase. It wasn't the company from the letter. It wasn't the opportunity she hadn't been able to answer, but it was hers. And that night, when the lights came down and the music started, she felt exactly what she had always been reaching for: home. In the front rows were Ethan, Lily, and Margaret. In the last row, her parents. Her mother with something bright in her eyes. Her father with his hands clean. Some things don't change. And in this case, That was exactly what made it everything. Richard kept the folded program in the inner pocket of his jacket, the way he kept documents that mattered. Ethan learned the full names of everyone on his staff, not in a single announcement, not with any fanfare. He simply started using them, one by one, until the woman who had prepared his financial reports for 3 years was no longer the analyst, but Sandra Okafor. And the building manager was no longer the guy at the front desk, but Tom Reeves. Nobody commented on it, but something changed in how the office felt. Nora never knew, or maybe she did, because Ethan told her one evening the way you mentioned something small, without ceremony, as if it barely counted. She thought about it for a moment, and decided it did count. That small things were what everything else was built from. And outside, the city of New York kept its pace, indifferent, relentless, unbothered by signed contracts or cancelled engagements or a dancer and a CEO who had arrived at something real by the most improbable route imaginable. But that, as is always the case with things that are worth it, was exactly what made it real. If this story reached you, made you smile or made you feel something, I'd love to know. What would you rate it? From 0 to 10. Your feedback helps me keep creating stories worth your time. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one.